We continue now at the top of Daf Samech at Aleph and Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 68a. On the previous summit, the Gemara said that it should be okay to have a mashkon with nechiyasa, meaning to say that the lender takes a piece of property as collateral and he takes the produce and then he deducts a certain amount, a specific amount per year in terms of the loan. That should be okay because we find the same thing by a stei achuza, by an ancestral field that is made hektish. So you redeem that also. It's for a fixed sum. As the Gemara continues, kaparak la bi'arba zuzeh. It's redeemed for 4 zuz. Rashi says, parak lu b'arba zuzeh dahainu sela. 4 zuz is a sela. And so hachanami lo shna. So the same thing should be true over here. There should be no problem with a mashkon with nechiyasa with deductions. Rashi explains, hachanami lo shna dahachazinan dehecha deyorid l'safik. We see that when a person descends to the field, he's using the field. He doesn't know whether he's going to profit or not. V'nosein mo sela l'shana, and he gives a certain specific amount of money per year. Safik yu ba'peros, safik lo yu ba'peros, and we don't know whether there's going to be produce or not. Havizvini meikaru mifrak bahachi. You see, that's considered a sale at the outset, and it can be redeemed in this fashion. And again, the same thing should be true over here when we're talking about a collateral on a loan. And the Gemara continues, Uman da'asr. Now, the person who says it's prohibited and does not bring a proof from the case of stei achuza, Amar loch, he will say to you, stei achuza hektishi. By stei achuza, by the ancestral field, essentially the field was made hektish. V'rachmana ukmei apidyon, and it's the Torah that says that there's redemption. We establish a certain amount for the redemption. But over here, halvohi, over here it actually is a loan. That's how it originates. It originates as a loan, umichsi karibis, and therefore it looks like ribis, and therefore it's problematic. You can't bring a proof from stei achuza. Rashi explains, Hasam lav halvo, over there it's not a loan. Bepidyon talia milsa, it's just redemption. V'rachmona ukmei hai pidyon, the Torah says this is the redemption. V'yamar b'hachi nifrak, and says this is how we redeem. You can't bring any proof to a case of a loan. And the Gemara continues, Amar Ravashi says, Amru li save de Masechet, the elders of Masechet said to me, Stam mashkanta shasa, that a stam mashkon, meaning a stam collateral, is for 1 year. The Gemara says, Lamai nafkamina, what difference does that make? What does that mean? It means the achal la shasa, it means that if the lender was on the property, meaning he took the property as collateral and he was taking produce, if he did that for a year, so matzi mesalikle. So then the borrower can pay back the loan and remove him from the property. V'lo, but if not, if he wasn't even there a year, lo matzi mesalikle. So then the borrower is not able to remove him from the property. And Rashi explains the lo matzi mesalikle, you can't remove him from the property in the first year. Kol shenaso, that entire first year he can't be removed. And Rashi notes, ve'afilu ba'asr de mesalki, we're talking here even in a place where generally the lova can remove the lender. The point is, within that first year, the lova still cannot remove the lender because there's a minimum of a year. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Ravashi, and Ravashi says, Amru li sabei de Masechet, the elders of Masechet said to me, my mashkanta, what is this language of a mashkon? Why is the collateral referred to as a mashkon? The reason is the shchuna gabe. And Rashi explains, the shchuna gabe ein shachen karov mimenu. There's no neighbor that's closer to this property than this individual, meaning this malva. The malva who takes the property as collateral, he's considered to be the closest to this property. V'imbaha lova l'mocher, let's say the borrower wants to sell the property, ein b'bal metzrei shachen tov l'knoso kazeh. There is no person who is considered a bal metzar, meaning there's no neighbor that's better to buy it than this person. In general, when you sell a property, you're supposed to give the preference to the person who lives next door, so that way he can join his property together with this new property. In this situation, the malva is considered to be the closest to this property, and therefore he takes precedence. As the Gemara continues, Lamai nafkamina, what difference does this make that it's shchuna gabe, that he's like the neighbor? Ladina debat the bar mitzvah, for the din of the bordering property, as we just said, again, that person gets preference in this situation, the malva gets preference. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, Les hilchaso lo ketarshe papunoi. The halach is not like the tarshe papunoi, velo keshtari mechuznoi, not like the shtari mechuznoi, velo kechachire narshoi, and not like the chachire narshoi. All of this will be explained. The Gemara says, Ketarshe papunoi. What does it mean, Ketarshe papunoi? It means Ketarshe de Rav Papa. It's talking about the tacit interest we had earlier of Rav Papa. Rashi explains, Tarsha de Rav Papa. The Amar Lael, he said earlier, Shechroi lo pasid v'chulu. That was the case of Rav Papa, where he sold his beer at the higher price, the higher market price that would be later on in the season, and he said it shouldn't be considered interest. The reason why it shouldn't be considered interest is because there was really no gain for him from his perspective. So less hilchas kavase, but the halach is not like him. Keda'aman, like we said earlier, my chazes da'azlus basar didach. Why should we follow your perspective? Zil basar didhu. We should follow their perspective, meaning the buyer's perspective. From the buyer's perspective, it is interest, and therefore it is going to be problematic. That's what it means, tarshe papunoi. And the Gemara continues, shtari mechuznoi. What does it mean, shtari mechuznoi? They take the profit and they put that up with the principal. They create all of that into a debt. And then they write it all into a shtar. And the problem with that is, who says there will be a profit, and therefore it comes to a situation of interest. Rashi explains, Mechuznai b'nei Mechuza, these were the people of Mechuza. What they did was as follows, the Zakfi Revacha Karna. They put together the profit with the principal and they wrote it all up as an obligation. Shekonim Pragmatia Bale Batim. What they did was, they bought merchandise from the Bale Batim. V'nozan L'tagarim L'mechetz Ischar. And what they did was, they took the merchandise and they gave it to the merchants and they said, we're going to take half the profit. You go ahead, try to sell this merchandise, and we'll take half the profit. And they evaluated, this is probably going to be the profit. And they essentially estimated the profit, and they all wrote it up into a document that obligated them to give that profit. They wrote it into the shtar. Ploni chayiv leploni kach v'kach. Lizman ploni, so-and-so is going to be chayiv to pay so-and-so this amount at this time. And so in this situation, essentially what they're doing is they're lending the merchants these items, and then they're saying, you're going to owe us more. They're writing it in as an obligation. It's basically interest. That's why it's problematic. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Mar bar Ameimar le Ravashi. Mar bar Ameimar said to Ravashi, what do you mean that's problematic? Abba avid hachi, my father does exactly this. V'chiyasu l'kameh, and when they come to him, let's say they come to him and they say, look, we weren't able to profit. So mehemin lo, he just believes them, he trusts them, and then he doesn't obligate them to pay the profit that they wrote into the shtar. Essentially, it is based on his trust. As Rashi says, v'chiyasu l'kameh v'yamri leilo haver avachu, when they come to him and they say there wasn't any profit, mehemin lo, he believes them, and so therefore it's not a problem the way he does it. So the Gemara continues, Amarle said to him, well, that's all good if he's still around. If your father's around, he can do that. But what if he shachiv? What if he dies? And then the shtar falls before the orphans. So then it's going to be problematic. Already he might be able to do that, but that's not going to happen with the orphans. As Rashi says, and if your father's around at the time of the payment, he's a pious person, he trusts them. But what if he dies? The Yorshim are going to collect everything, so therefore it is problematic. And so again, my hava, what's going to be in that situation? And the Gemara says, it was like an error that came from the mouth of the ruler of Enoch Nafshe de Ameimar, and Ameimar indeed died at that moment, meaning Mar bar Ameimar was discussing this with Ravashi, and Ravashi essentially said, what if your father dies? And that's exactly what happened. Ameimar died. And the Gemara proceeds to explain the third case, Chachire Narshoy, the case of the Chachire Narshoy. Rashi says, Chachire, HaMekabel Soda Mechaveru Basar Kurin Lashana. This is like a sharecropper, but he's accepting the field and he's saying, I'm going to give you a specific amount. That's what it means, Chakirus. I'm going to give you 10 kor per year. Bein Tasa Harbe, Bein Tasa Mat. Doesn't matter if the field produces a lot or if it produces a little, I'm always going to give you the same amount. And so the Gemara continues, the Kasvi Hachi, they would write the following in their documents, Moshchen le Planya Are le Planya. They would say, so-and-so is mortgaging over his property to so-and-so, meaning the borrower is giving the lender the property as a collateral. V'hadar Chachra Minei. And then what would happen is immediately the lender would give the property back to the borrower and make the borrower into a situation of a sharecropper. He would tell the borrower, you now work the field, and you're going to give me a specific amount every year, whether it produces that much or not. And now that is problematic because essentially the lender is collecting interest. What the lender is taking is a fixed amount extra beyond the amount of the loan, and he's setting that up through this chakirus. And so the Gemara says, Amos Khan, at what point in time did the Malva acquire the field? He's not the owner of the field, the Akni and Hile, that he's able to now give it over to the borrower and make the borrower essentially a sharecropper in this case. And so therefore, that's problematic. It's a situation of interest. And Rashi explains, Chakire Narshoy Shayabalebatim Malvim Mos Lanim Al Sadoseyan. The Balabatim would lend money to the poor on their fields, meaning the fields would be mortgaged to the lenders. And then they would give the fields back to the Aniyim, that the Aniyim would have to work the field, and they would have to give the lender a specific amount of kor per year. And so that again, that would be problematic as a situation of ribis. And Rashi continues, when did the Malva acquire this field? The that he's able to give it back to the original owner as a chakirus, nimsa notel ribis katsutza, comes out that he's really just collecting fixed ribis. Sharei ein torach, but he's not working it at all. V'afem tilka lo yafsid me chakirus so klum. And even if the field doesn't produce, he's not going to lose anything. He's going to get that amount, so it's basically interest. And the Gemara continues, Voidna, but nowadays, the kakas v'hachi, we write it as follows: Kanina minei v'shoyina kama idne, that he acquires it from him, and then he does have it for some set amount of time. The lender actually does work the field for a few years, and he does deductions. He deducts each year from the loan. V'hadar chakra, and only then does he give it back to the borrower to work it and work as a sharecropper that gives back a fixed amount. So that already is going to be okay. Kedei shelo tinol dalas bifnei love, in order that we don't close the door before borrowers. This encourages people to lend, so shaper dummy. So the Gemara says it's okay if you do it with this arrangement, but in the end the Gemara says v'lav milsi, that's not actually true. Even this arrangement does not make it any better. And Rashi explains, Shahina kama idonin biyad hamalva, the lender keeps it for a certain period of time, v'yasahu, and he's the one that works the field, v'yachol ben achyasa, and he consumes the produce and he deducts from the debt, v'hadar chakra minei, and then he establishes this chakira, so shaper dummy, that's okay, kedei shelo tinol delis, that way the door is not closed before borrowers, dekevan d'shia gabe v'yachal talos shenin, since he kept it with him and had it for 3 years, so mali yavid boyu, mali chakra, so at that point in time already, what's the difference if he works it or if he gives it back to the borrower to work it, and the borrower will pay him? But the Gemara in the end says, V'lav milsi, it's not true. De'afilu shianami, even if he delays in terms of setting up this chakiros, asr, it's still prohibited. The ribis gemuri, this is clear ribis, it's clear interest. She'in kan safik ka'osa v'yochel shapamim shemotzi v'eno notel. This is not a case of a doubt where we don't know whether the field is going to produce. Here the lender is guaranteed a certain amount back, and therefore it's a problem of ribis. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Ein moshiven chenvani lemechzis schar. You're not allowed to set up a storekeeper for a situation of taking half the profits. We'll see Rashi. V'lo yitein mos likach ben peiros lemechzis schar. Similarly, you can't give money in order that he buys produce again to take half the profits. You can't set up these arrangements of half the profits. Elim kein nosein lo secharo kapol. The only way you can do it is if you pay the person that's trying to make the profits, that's doing the work. You pay the storekeeper like a worker, so then it's not a problem of ribis anymore. And similarly, the Mishnah continues, Ein moshivin tarnagolin, you're not allowed to give over chickens, lemechza, again, for half profits. Vein shaman agolin v'sayachin lemechza, you can't do that with calves. You can't do that with young horses for half the profits. Elim kein nosein lo schara molam mazono, unless he pays him for his efforts, and he has to give him the sustenance. Aval mekavlin agolin v'sayachin lemechza, but the Gemara does say you are allowed to receive calves and young horses for half profits. Umegadlin osan ad shiu meshulashin, and you raise them until they're a third of maturity. V'chamor, you could do that with a donkey also, achetei toenes, until it's able to carry a load. And Rashi explains, Ein moshiven chenvani lemechzis schar, lo yomer balabayis lechenvani, a balabayis shouldn't say to a storekeeper, hare peiros nimkorim b'shuk arba soim b'sela. Right now, the produce is sold in the marketplace, you get 4 saw per sela. V'yatam mochrim b'chanos pruta pruta. Now you sell it in the store, you sell it little by little. Umistaker saw, you're able to make a profit of a saw. Heilach peiros, so what you should do is take these peiros from me, v'shav u'mocher tam, and I want you to keep selling them little by little, v'harevach nachlok, and then we'll just divide the profit. So I'm essentially giving you these peiros as a loan, and then you're going to make a certain amount of profit, and we will split the profit. That is problematic. And Rashi explains why it's a problem. The time of the meal, so the reason why it's a problem, mishum damrinu lekamon, because we're going to say later on, hach iska palga milvu palga pikon. What's actually happening when you do a situation of half the profits, you're basically saying, I'm going to take half the profits, but I'm also going to take half the loan, half the loss rather. So that's the equivalent of saying half of what I'm giving you is a loan, and half of what I'm giving you is a pikadon, is a deposit. That's essentially the same thing. Stam ha-mekabel pragmatia lemechzis schar. When somebody accepts merchandise for half profit, mekabel olav achrayas chatzi akeren ba'ons and vazula. So what he's really saying is he's taking responsibility on half of it. Half of it is fully his responsibility. The principal, if any onus happens, if it goes down in value. Hilka chahi palga keven the mechai ba'ons. So therefore, since on half of it he's taking responsibility, full responsibility, even for accidents, so milvahu etzlo. So that part is considered to be a loan. Sharei shumahi etzlo b'mo. mos kashar ashukah, because they're evaluating that, how much it's worth according to the market price, and saying he owes that no matter what. Vidino litol chatzi schar, and then we say that again, he's going to be able to take half the profits. So nimtza misasik bechetzi shel balabayis shu pikadon. So what's really happening is he's doing work with the half of the balabayis, which is a deposit, shu pikadon atzla, which is a deposit by him, beschar hamtanas mos hamilva, for the fact that he was loaned the other part. Lafika chaser, therefore it's going to be usher, it's going to be forbidden. Again, in that situation, let's say the storekeeper who's getting the merchandise, half of that merchandise is basically a pikadon, meaning to say, half of that merchandise, the profit and the loss, has nothing to do with the original owner. The profit and the loss is going to be completely on the side of the storekeeper. And so in other words, what Rashi is saying is, let's say, for example, the merchandise is $100 worth of merchandise that the storekeeper is trying to sell, and let's say it profits at $200, so we say we split that profit. You're going to split that extra $100 of profit into $50 for the storekeeper and $50 for the original owner. But what's actually happening in that situation is the original $100 of merchandise that's being given to the storekeeper, so $50 of that merchandise is a loan, and the storekeeper is basically saying, I'm going to return to you $50 no matter what happens. It's just going to be $50, and I, the storekeeper, will take any of the profits and any of the losses that has to do with that $50. But then the other $50 of the merchandise, that's essentially a pikadon, that's still in the reshus of the original owner, and therefore that part, if it goes up, so then the original owner is going to get that profit on that $50, or he's going to take the losses on that, and so that essentially works out to dividing 50-50 the profits. So you have over here a situation where the storekeeper is getting a loan, and in exchange for the loan, he's doing work on behalf of the balabayis, so that's basically interest, and the only way that's okay, he has to actually pay him for the work that he's doing on half of it. If he pays him for the work, so then it's not going to be a problem of interest. And similarly, the Mishnah continued, Ein Moshivin Tarnagolim Lemech, so you're not going to do the same thing with chickens for half profit. What that means is Lashum Beitzim Bedamim Lebala Tarnagolis, Loshiva Aleim Legadel Afrochim. What you're going to do is, you're going to take some eggs, and you're going to evaluate, you're going to give them over to the owner of the chicken, and the owner of the chicken is going to place the chicken upon the eggs. The chicken will sit on the eggs in order to raise young chicks. Lemech Sischar, and it's going to be, again, you're going to have half the profits. Mashu Afroch and Shav and Yosar, whatever the Afrochim, whatever those young chicks are worth, more than the value of the eggs. You're essentially giving over the eggs to this individual, and he's going to try to make a profit with the eggs using his chicken. It's the same idea. So since this person who's receiving the eggs and trying to make the profit is accepting upon himself responsibility for half of them, if they get ruined or if they die, it's the same thing. Half of it becomes a loan. Because again, that's being evaluated what it's worth right now, that I owe you for sure. And that's considered a loan. So the person is really raising the other half of the eggs, and he's doing that because he was extended a loan, and so that's a problem of interest. So the only way that works again is if you pay the person, you also have to give him a zono. You have to give the person its sustenance. Whatever food that he's using to feed the Efrochim, he's got to be paid for that as well, again, or else it's going to be a problem of interest. And Rashi continues, similarly, you're not allowed to evaluate calves or young horses for half profit. Again, now there were such and such. You should accept them, and you're going to raise them for 2 years. It's going to be, we'll split the profits or we'll split the losses if they die. But Rashi continues, but you are allowed to accept young calves or young horses below shum if you don't do an evaluation, if you don't take any responsibility. That if they die, you're not going to pay anything. But if they live, so then you'll split the profits. That's already okay, and you make that arrangement until they reach 1/3 of their maturity. Meaning once they reach that third of maturity, at that point of time you split it. That's going to be okay. That's going to be okay, because if you're not taking responsibility for the loss, it's essentially not a problem of taking a loan and giving interest. And similarly, v'chamor, by a donkey, megadla acheteto and esmasoi, you raise it until it can carry a burden. This was just the minhag that they raise them before they divided. That's how they worked it out, and that would be permitted. And the Gemara says, Tana was taught, Kepoel Batal, when it says that you pay the person, if you pay the person like a worker, so then it's okay, it's not a problem of interest, that means you pay him like a Poel Batal. That means a worker who's just being paid to sit and really do nothing. The Gemara says, My Kepoel Batal, what do you mean you pay like a Poel Batal? Why should that be the case? There is work being done over here. What does that even mean? Rashi explains, Tana Kepoel Batal, Uvamas Nisan Lo Garsin and Batal. In the Mishnah, it doesn't say the word Batal, that's what's being added by this Brisa. Kepoel Batal, Mashma Kama Adam Rotzalito, Valeshe Batal. Poel Batal means, how much would a person want to be paid that he's just supposed to sit there and do nothing? My Kapol Batal, the Gemara asks, well, what do you mean Kapol Batal? That doesn't make any sense. Haloin Yoshevu Batal, the person's not sitting doing nothing. Sharei Torach, Laholech, Lahavi Peres Lachanus, he has to take efforts to bring the produce to the store, Valimchorn, to sell the produce, or Lakavel Mos, to receive money, Valim Dora Peros, and to measure everything out. So what do you mean Kapol Batal? That doesn't make sense. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Ches Amud Beis.